So just a little bit of background on Tony. He has been providing consultancy services in higher education for a number of years, specialising in training and in the planning and management of online learning and distant education programmes. So he's worked with about 40 higher education organisations across the globe, across 25 countries. So we're delighted to have Tony with us and to share with us over the next hour. So thanks, Tony. I'm going to hand over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm getting a little bit of feedback here. That's better. Okay, well, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. I think the conference organizers have maybe made a mistake here. Every author loves to talk about their book, and I could go on forever talking about this book. But what I'll try and do is to focus on the key messages. Really, there are three parts of this presentation. The first part are about the key messages in the book. The second part is about the impact of COVID, not so much on the book, but generally, and which is the really reason why I'm doing a third edition, is to make sure that the book reflects what happened during COVID. And the last part is looking at some general conclusions. So first of all, about the book. All my other books were done through commercial publishers. This is different. It's an online open textbook, which is freely available over the internet. We could talk a lot about the pros and cons of open publishing for academics. I'm at the end of my career, and I don't need, frankly, the kudos of having it published by a main publisher. If I was 40, 50 years younger, then that might be more different. But what I wanted to do was to get this book out and get it as read by as many people as possible. And in that, I've been highly successful. I was able to do that because in my province here, there is a government organization called BC Campus, which supports technology use in post-secondary education. And they've been running an open textbook project now since 2015. And in fact, all the first year courses in both universities and colleges now have at least one open textbook that students can use. It saves students millions of dollars in buying commercial textbooks. Since the book came out in 2015, I've actually lost count now. The software doesn't actually track this kind of numbers, but there's been about 1 million downloads of the book since 2015. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean 1 million readers. It could be just one person who's got some kind of compulsion downloading the book 1 million times. But certainly it's been translated into 10 languages. And I do know it's used by individuals and for teacher training and faculty development all around the world. For instance, in France, teachers taking the national qualification exams have to take the French version of this book. And I'm now doing the third edition, as I mentioned, to cover COVID and a bit more focus on schools. I originally wrote it for higher education instructors, and I was really surprised and pleased at how many teacher training courses took up this book, because and that brings me really to the reason for the book. There are really two big changes since the turn of the 21st century. The booming digital economy and the demand for what are called 21st century skills. I say a little bit about what I mean by that. But basically, the workforce is changing, and there is this demand for often transdisciplinary skills like independent learning, critical thinking, and so on. And the second big change is the internet, of course. It affects not only the economy, but the potential for education. And I couldn't really find another book specifically focused on the implications for teaching and learning of new media and online blended learning that was written for teachers and instructors. There's lots of books about how technology is going to change education, it's going to disrupt it, and so on. But when you get down to it, most of this is sort of high tech boosters of technology in education, and I wanted something that was more pragmatic, that will give the pros and cons of using technology for teaching, specifically aimed at instructors in higher education and teachers in schools. The book focuses on offering teachers and instructors different choices. I can't tell a physics teacher how to teach physics, or a history teacher how to teach history. I'm not a specialist in those areas. But what I can do is to suggest some options for them, some choices. So I suggest a range of teaching methods that they could use. How to make decisions about use of technology. I talk more about media than technology. Media is a richer term. It covers both the creation, delivery, and interpretation of messages, and not just the technology, although technology is essential for media delivery. And I talk about different modes of deliveries, such as blended learning or fully online or face-to-face, and the implications of that. And my aim is to provide information and options for instructors to make their own decisions. So, for instance, one of the things I talk about is the media selection model. And here are the sort of 8 things you have to take into consideration when making a decision about using a particular piece of technology. And you would work through those and come up with some kind of intuitive decision as a result of collecting the information each of those 8 areas for what works best in your subject area. And you'll notice that although for teaching, media characteristics and instructional strategies is a very important part of that, most media selection theories don't look at all the other things such as cost and time and organizational issues, like whether you have the technology and whether the institution supports it. So again, I've tried to broaden the basis for decision making here. So what are the key messages? Well, I want to focus more on, I think education needs to focus more on specific 21st century skills development. If you look, this is a typical small business. It's about 4 people, 3 people. They're actually engineers who, and what they do, they design parts used in German automotive car manufacturing. And they're the whole company. They not only do the design, they do the marketing, they do the fundraising. So they work as a team, but they have to cover all those skills as well as knowing about engineering. So not that knowing about engineering isn't important, but they also have to be pretty good at a lot of other things as well. And one of the things that we have an organization in one of our provinces in Ontario called the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario. And they did an interesting study a couple of years ago. They tested students on 3 things: literacy, numeracy, and critical thinking as they entered university. And then they tested them 4 years later after they graduated. And what they found is that while numeracy and literacy skills did increase, there was no measurable increase in critical thinking skills. Now, you can have a lot of argument about whether they did the right kind of assessment of critical thinking, because to some extent, critical thinking is embedded in subject disciplines, but it was a worrying finding. What they found is there's too much emphasis on covering loads of content and not enough on assessing students' use and applications of that content. And one of the problems for students and for instructors is the knowledge base is expanding rapidly. There's new findings every year in disciplines like medicine, engineering, health, and so on. So when people finish their degree, they have to go on learning. And so a core skill is knowledge management, knowing where to find information, how to analyze that information, how to apply it, and use it appropriately. Another message is that there is a continuum of educational delivery now. There's not just distance education and face-to-face teaching. There's a whole continuum here. Things merge into one another now. So what we've got is classroom, sometimes technology just used to aid the classroom teaching. We have flipped classrooms where the instructor puts the instructor on TV and the students download it, watch it beforehand, then come in and discuss that. There's hybrid learning where students deliberately, where instructors deliberately design for both the online part and the face-to-face parts to make what I will call affordances of each. And then we've got high flex where students can choose whichever method of learning that they want. The instructor has a variety of ways of delivering the course so that it can suit all kinds of students and not just those who can come to campus. And lastly, I wanted to point out that teaching methods are not necessarily dependent on the mode of delivery. You can do experiential learning or constructivist teaching face-to-face. You can do it online. You can do it hybrid and blended and so on. Now, there are differences in how you design courses across those different modes of delivery, but basically you can adapt any kind of teaching method, including, incidentally, STEM laboratory and vocational practices online if you have enough time and money to do that. So they're not intrinsically dependent on the mode of delivery. However, I want to make this point that teaching still needs to be redesigned for online and blended delivery. What we did find from COVID, and I'll talk a lot more about this later in the talk, is that moving lectures online is not a good idea. I'll come back to that in a later. And another important point here is who should decide the mode of delivery. It should really be the student's choice. What drives the need for blended or hybrid or fully online learning are the needs of the students. What kind of students have you got? And the effectiveness of the mode of delivery depends on the qualitative design in teaching within the mode. For instance, you can teach badly face-to-face, but you can also teach badly online. So it doesn't really matter which, in terms of quality, which method you use, so long as you design properly for that method of teaching. And the other thing that came out of COVID particularly is that both synchronous, same time, same place learning, like face-to-face teaching, and asynchronous learning, where students work independently of the instructor, both have value. But for fully online learners, certainly asynchronous is more valuable for all kinds of reasons, particularly the flexibility. And that has implications, again, for how we design during emergencies like COVID and so on. Another message is that we need to focus on the affordances of different media, what each does best, including in-person teaching. And the reason that I make that is that the default model has always been face-to-face teaching is superior. And we have a lot of research that shows that's just not true. You can do online learning just as well as in-person teaching. There are some instances where in-person teaching has some affordances that are better than online. But we need to identify what those are and base it on evidence and not on just gut feeling. And in particular, I think every instructor now needs to ask themselves the question, why should students get on the bus to come to my lecture on campus when I could be delivering this program in a more flexible way that would not necessitate students coming on the bus? And in particular, what are you offering on campus that students could not get online? In other words, we need to raise the bar for deciding that face-to-face is the best option. I'm not saying it's not a good option in many circumstances, but it has to be focused on what the students are getting in terms of benefits from that. And they need to be measured, not just assume that because you're a nice guy or a very able lecturer, that this is exactly what students want. COVID has shown that many students want a lot more flexibility because they lead complicated lives. They've got jobs, they've got families, and so on. So we should be making much more conscious decisions about what we do face-to-face and what we do online. Another message is that new media are underused. Text and speech still dominate, but even in the 7 years since I started writing this book, massive amounts of free and good quality video is now available that can be used for educational purposes. Not necessarily educational material, but video that could be used as part of the teaching. When I first wrote my book, I had about 35 affordances of video. And these were developed when I was at the British Open University, 40 years ago, when I was evaluating the difference between the text and the TV broadcasts and the radio broadcasts made by the BBC. And so what I did is took those affordances and looked for free online examples. And when I did the first version in 2015, I could easily find good examples for about half of those affordances. By the time I've come to do the third edition, I have enough video to have examples for them all. And that's just an example of how the amount of good quality video is becoming available now, but we're not using it enough in education. And the last thing, and this is a really important one, is that technology is shifting the power from the teacher to the learners. And by that, I mean, learners can now use media themselves to demonstrate their learning. They can make videos, they can make podcasts, they can actually demonstrate their learning and send it to you in forms other than essays or paper and pencil tests and so on. And this is a big shift in power, because what we can do is to release that power of the students to add and create their own versions of knowledge, and then have that as a kind of form of something to discuss between the instructors and the students, which I think is a very important shift. I want to give one example of that. This is an interactive classroom at Queen's University. You'll see that the instructor is sitting like Captain Kirk in Star Trek at the pod in command, but the students all have their own tables to which they can plug their computers, and each table has a screen. So students can work, and they can also go, there's outside, you can't see, but there are little study areas where an individual student can go and do a bit of research and come back into the group. So what you have now is these self-managed groups, well, not completely self-managed, you've got an instructor and helping them, but they can actually work together within the classroom, demonstrate their work either to each other or to the whole class, depending on how the instructor wants to organize it. And what's interesting is, I think Winston Churchill said, we design our buildings, but our buildings change us. What the university found is that when an instructor goes into that class, they change their method of teaching. The room almost forces them to teach in another way. And I think one of the big implications for digital learning is that we need to redesign and restructure our classrooms to take account of digital learning. Another lesson is that before COVID, we had 30 years of research and best practices in online learning. And I was somewhat shocked to see that this was largely ignored during the pandemic. Now, there does differ from institution to institution. One of the outcomes of the research on the impact of the pandemic is that institutions that were already had a fairly large online teaching component did much better during COVID than the ones that had no previous online experience. And that's not surprising. But nevertheless, even institutions that had online teaching experience, because of the emergency, the speed at which it happened, in Canada, over 100,000 university instructors went online within 2 weeks during the pandemic. There just wasn't enough time to train many of the instructors, even in institutions that had online learning, who'd never done online learning before. But there is this 30 years of research and best practices, and we ignore it at our peril. And the last message is that the future is open education resources, open pedagogy, and so on. Not because I've done my book this way, but because the internet is this huge resource out there, and much of it is open, and we have to take account of that. We have to remember that universities were created. The library was very, very important because often there was the only copy of written work going back to medieval times. And that environment where universities controlled access to knowledge has gone. Students can go anywhere now and find what they need. I'll give you a personal story about my grandson here. I went to visit him in England, and he was on his computer, and I said, "Are you playing a game?" And he says, "No, I'm doing my physics work." And I said, "Well, does your instructor give you online learning then?" And he said, "Oh no, my instructor's terrible. He comes in, he covers the board he's doing physics, my grandson, and he covers the board in writing." And so I got together with two friends, and we go to 1/3 of the lectures. We share the lectures, and I just write down the topics when I go because I can't follow what he's saying. And then we go online to Massachusetts Institute of Technology's open open courseware project, and look up the subject matter and listen to those lectures because they're so much clearer. Now, this is pretty scary when you think about it. We definitely need to. I've lost the slides, by the way. Thank you. So we definitely need to think about the fact that there is so much information out there that students can be using. Again, it comes back to the emphasis between content and skills. We don't have to teach content. We have to organize content. We have to show students what content to learn. But in most cases, it's already better taught than I could do in my area or you can do in your area. There are examples out there that students can use. So let's focus on their skills more than on the content. Content is important. So I'm going to ask some questions here. I don't know if you've got the ability to collect questions here and ask them to me directly, but do you agree that we're living through a paradigm shift in teaching and learning, or is this just all hype? Skills or content, do we have the balance right? Are we specifically teaching intellectual skills like creative thinking, independent learning, communication skills within the subject domain, and so on? What should we focus on doing on campus when students can access most content online? And any other questions or comments you may have. So, Karina, can I ask you to take some questions here?
Everybody in the room? Will we look at the first one? Do you agree that we are living through a paradigm shift in teaching and learning, or is this all just hype? Or is this all hype? Any views? Anything come to mind, Sean?
I think we're living through a technological change. I don't think our paradigms have caught up or shifted really too much at all. I think we're sort of grasping around.
Yeah. Any other comments, Sharon?
I think, you know, a lot of the students that we will have now coming up, 18-year-olds plus, they're living through a world where they're learning in a very different way. A lot of them don't want to be reading big, long textbooks. So we have to respond to their method of learning, and we have to help them with these new ways. So yeah, absolutely, we're going to have to one way or the other.
I keep thinking of Etane and the students this morning, you know, meeting them where they're at, such a brilliant example, and, you know, bringing in the Minecraft and whatever's going, you know, to teach them maths. It is changing. And the questions are gone. What was the next question? Skills or content? Do we have the balance right? Are we teaching intellectual skills effectively? Do we have the balance right? Any views? And you know, Tony, we have Meg Benck, Professor Meg Benck in the audience here with us. I know you know each other.
I'm
Jessica might have a comment there.
Yeah, oh sorry, Jess. Oh sorry, somebody online has a comment. Yes?
Yeah, so there, the shift from scarce to ambiguous information is the biggest shift. It changes the balance of power. And somebody else says, I think it is dependent on the subject. For example, science. I think the students need to come on campus to practice lab skills.
Okay, very good. Who was that from?
Yeah.
Sorry, Ashton Coyle was the second, and the first one was Perry Share.
Okay, thanks Aisling and Perry. And anybody from the room want to comment on that? Any further comments? Are we getting the balance right?
Just, I don't think, at least for me, I'm getting it right. I teach robotics, and I think we are doing the paradigm shift. But for me, even I am very used to the technologies and online. I find it difficult to teach robotics online. I don't know how to do it yet. I'm still exploring it. So
Okay.
I'm missing it, at least for me.
Yeah.
Any comments there? You can hear okay, Tony, can you?
Yeah, yes. If I can make a comment on teaching skills, particularly, there's a big curriculum issue here. How do we, if I'm teaching critical thinking in history, and I'm teaching a second or third year course, how do I know what critical thinking skills are being taught in the year before? And what do I add to that in terms of increasing their critical thinking performance at bits and hand that on to the third year? I mean, it has implications for curriculum planning and being specific about skills and how they're taught within the subject domain. There are lots of different ways to teach critical thinking. I'm not worried about that. My worry is about how you, first of all, measure them and know that students are actually improving in that critical thinking skill as they go through university. I take thinking because it's one that most instructors would feel they try to teach, so it doesn't matter on the subject area. Now, the way you teach that by subject will vary greatly, but I think it's really important that you know when you've got students coming in what their previous level of critical thinking is and what you're going to do in your course to improve that. And I think that's a big challenge. I'm not sure many instructors could actually answer that if you sat them down and said, well, how are you going to test them when they come in? And how are you going to test them when they go out? And what will you have done to improve them?
Hi, Tony, just I suppose we teach adult learners, and I think that the mode of delivery for us would be to take into consideration their expectations and the expectations of their employer, number one. Number two, the teaching style and the capability and confidence of the instructor, number two. And number three, we always have to pay attention to the context. We're going to make sure that we keep an eye on the learning outcomes, so when we teach to the learning outcomes, we can assess to the learning outcomes, and they learn against the learning outcomes.
Yeah, I'm having a little difficulty hearing the comments from the floor. So I didn't quite get that. Could you repeat that, Karina, or the essence of it? Hello?
To the mic.
Hello?
Can you hear? I don't think he can hear us.
No, I can. I couldn't. I
Can you
can
hear
the
us?
comment. Yes, I can hear you. No, I can't.
You're on.
Okay. You go.
So Tony, we teach, I'm a group of a number of lecturers that teach adult learners. And so they come in and they learn in the evenings. And we've just redesigned our programs to make it more flexible. So it's a blended program at the moment. But just, I suppose, my comments on the mode of delivery going forward. Like, we've learned a lot in the last 2 years with COVID, but I think there's 3 considerations. The first consideration is that we need to understand the expectations of our post-COVID adult learner, as well as their employers who are funding them. That's the first consideration. The second consideration is the teaching style and the capability and the confidence of the instructor. And the third one, which I think is the most important, is the context of what we're teaching. There's different modules, different topics, different teaching styles work for different things. So we need to keep an eye on the learning outcomes. So we teach against them, and that the learners learn against them.
Well, I would agree with everything you've said. I try to make the point in the book that I can't tell individual instructors how best to teach their subjects and so on. You have to take account of the context in which you're working. So, yes, I can say, here's the direction I think you should be going, but how you get there, really, here are some suggestions, but in the end, you have to make the decisions. One of the things that worries me about the developments in artificial intelligence is that it's taken away that input of an instructor who has a lot more sensitivity to what students need than is collected just by data from student performances and so on.
Tony, thanks, Marilla. And Jessica, another question there coming in.
Yeah, just some comments. Carrie Share adds that stresses between module outcomes and program outcomes, we don't pay enough attention to the latter. And Kevin McCarthy adds, he wants to say hello, Tony, Karina, and Mick. Reimagining what is possible both online and on campus are complementary rather than competitive. It shouldn't be one or the other, but a combination of the best of both.
That's great. Hi, Ken from Waterford. It is.
One more from Lucia Cluden here in ATU Galway. Students need analysis. Student needs analysis happens at the beginning of each semester for some modules, but I think this needs to happen at program level before delivery and assessment methods are finalized for each cohort.
Right. Some good points. Thanks, Lucia. Did you get that, Tony?
Yes, sort of. I think I should move on at this point to the impact of COVID. But thanks for the comments. That's very interesting. So if okay. My internet clicker has gone dead. I just have to reactivate it, then it will be okay. There we go. Okay. Okay, before 2020, online learning was mainly asynchronous. It was the use of learning management systems. It was primarily text-based. But during COVID, most online learning moved to synchronous. And there were good reasons for this. Instructors were able simply to transfer their in-person lecture methods online. That was the quickest and easiest way of doing it. The technology was relatively easy to use. People were using Zoom. I found it very easy to use. Most institutions already had a license for the technology, so it was already around before COVID came along. And frankly, there was no time to reconsider designing courses. So this isn't a criticism of putting lectures online in the spring of 2020. However, we're now 2 years into that. We've learned a lot, and we should be rethinking what we're doing. The claimed advantages of synchronous learning is that it enables more powerful social learning. Students learn more socially when they're all together. Instructors have a better feel of what students are learning if they're there in front of them. There's more targeted discussion in a live face-to-face group, and it allows for spontaneous questions and discussion. Now, first of all, I would point out that these are all subjective views of the advantages of synchronous in-person learning, and they're all possible online with the right design. So again, we need to have a bit more research behind this in identifying what can and cannot be done online and face-to-face. There were lots of problems with synchronous online learning. We've had a lot of research data in now. First of all, let me say that students vary a great deal. Some students actually really enjoyed the online stuff and others didn't. But the criticisms that came in from particularly student surveys was there was too much passive screen time, just watching the screens. And it's easy to forget that students are often, certainly in Canada, taking 10 different courses at the same time. So they're going from one 1 hour lecture to another 1 hour lecture to another 1 hour lecture, sometimes 8 hours of solid lecturing online during the day. There was too little student activity, especially in the large classes. Students got overloaded with work, but not only the students, the instructors as well. You see the student asleep here. What tended to happen was that instructors would do their full teaching load, full lecture load, and then because they were worried that students wouldn't necessarily cover everything that was done in the lecture, they give them extra work on top of that. And that's all right if you just do it on one subject, if you're just teaching one subject, learning one subject, but if you're doing 10, then it just became too much work. Most students wanted recordings of the lectures so they could go over them again and repeat them and so on. But many instructors didn't want to do that because they wanted the interaction with the students, although in practice they often didn't get much. And of course, the main problem from the students' point of view was the lack of the social aspects that result from being on campus. But in a sense, that's not a fault of online learning. That just wasn't possible during COVID. I mean, basically, it was either online learning or no teaching or learning. That was the choice. But the social aspects are really important for many young students, but not for all students, like adult learners, for instance. So what do we learn from quite a lot of research that's been done on the impact of COVID? First of all, classroom lecturing needs major adaptation when moved online. Shorter chunks of presentation followed by interaction. That's why I'm breaking this session up with some questions and so on. More use of breakout rooms and smaller groups for discussion. You don't get good discussion with 100 people online. And it's really important that afterwards that there's a recording of the lecture that's available to all students. The other thing is that lectures should be used in conjunction with asynchronous online activities, particularly the use of the learning management system. If that's the case, it's really important not to overload students with work. Coming back to the point that students can find lots of content online, then the lectures or the online presentation should deal with how students are finding that information, how they're organizing it and learning it, rather than focusing on just delivering the content that's already out there on the internet. And if possible, one of the things that I recommend in my book is that if you have a class, say, of 3 credits in North America, which would be roughly 3 one-hour lectures a week, think of that as 8 hours of student study time. That's their total study time, including all activities they do online, all the assignment work that they do, the assessment and so on. They have about 8 hours for your one course. You can see if they're doing 5 courses at the same time, which is often one semester's work, then that works out to about 40 hours a week for the students. So start with the student workload and work back, and then decide how much should be done synchronously online. And if possible, redesign for online delivery with asynchronous the core, supplemented with limited synchronous learning that focuses on its affordances. The other thing we learned from COVID, and came as a real surprise to me, we'd always thought of online learning as increasing access. It got to students who couldn't get to campus. But when everybody went online, we found that there were students who couldn't access online learning or had great difficulties. Now, I know that Ireland has one of the most comprehensive coverage of internet access of any country in the world. And certainly in Canada, we have pretty good internet access as well, and except for the very remote rural areas. But even in urban areas, we are finding that up to 20% of the students were having problems. They didn't have broadband access. Now, when I say broadband, they had internet access, but they didn't have it at the bandwidth which allow for video, Zoom lectures and so on, or even PowerPoints. So for those students, asynchronous learning is really important. Some households had 5 or 6 people using devices at the same time, especially during COVID. Parents were at home working, students were at home studying. The bandwidth that they had, the Wi-Fi bandwidth, often just wasn't sufficient to handle everything. And video conferencing uses 3 times the bandwidth of a learning management system. And some households couldn't afford the equipment or the data plans that were required for the effective delivery of online learning. And of course, these were the poor and most disadvantaged already. So I think that if you are going to have online learning, whether in an emergency or not, you need to be very much aware that there will be a significant minority for whom you may need to make alternative arrangements to allow them to participate properly. And what this means is that every institution or jurisdiction needs a strategy to reach the disadvantage with online learning. We should not be depriving them of the option. There are various ways to do this. Wi-Fi hotspots with free, secure access. For instance, public libraries. Students can go to the local public library and maybe study there. But again, the institution needs to make arrangements with the libraries so they know that this is going to happen. Equipment loans. During COVID, a lot of schools loaned iPads and computers to students so they could study at home. On-campus access, again, if students are studying online and face-to-face, they need somewhere on campus where they can study online individually. Again, the libraries often provide this, but the demand is such now that you need to have these little study carrels where students can go and just plug in their computer and go online all around the university so that they can come straight out of a lecture, for instance, and go and do some work nearby in a study carrel. You need earmarked funding for this to make sure that disadvantaged students have access. And you need partnerships with the telecom companies and business and so on to help make sure that there's widespread Wi-Fi access for all students? So, questions again. Karina, has COVID changed everything in university teaching, or will things just go back to normal now? Do you agree that moving lectures online is a bad idea? And if not, why not? In Ireland, 92% of homes have internet access. So should we worry about those that do not have it? And what were the other impacts you saw of COVID on teaching and learning? So can I hand that back to you, Karina?
Well, I'll put it out there to the floor. Anybody want to give some comments on any of the questions? First of all, I suppose just to give a comment, it's just interesting, the digital divide, challenges that you've raised there, Tony. And certainly I know colleagues across the sector have been working recently in the response to an EU call, and it's nationally as well. And Ken actually is on the call here today. We're looking at a national it's a resilience plan around transformation and reform in teaching and learning and managing that digital divide going forward. So it's quite timely. Your conversation today and the questions you're raising actually are very much part of, I suppose, the TU plans over the next couple of years for the technological sector and how we're going to address that, looking at things, teaching and learning through the EDI lens and that. So like the point you've made in Ireland, 92% of homes have internet access. So should we worry about those that do not have it? Absolutely. And then Sean, sorry?
So we have to worry about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's bigger issues there as well around access to higher education and how do we provide high flex opportunities for disadvantaged groups to access and progress into higher ed. So it's certainly on our radar, and there's a lot of conversations around that. So I suppose that comes under the question of impacts of COVID and teaching and learning. We're really looking at it from a different lens. I think you made a good point there, Meg. We were chatting about this over lunch as well, about it's not just about transformation in, as we'd say, the traditional teaching and learning, but we're actually seeing online teaching and flexible learning through a different lens. And even though we've been very fortunate over the last couple of years upskilling in the digital ed space, we're still rethinking and re-examining that. Just even, Annette, maybe you've comments on the first question. Has COVID changed everything in university teaching? Because you've worked with so many colleagues on this over the last...
Well, I suppose, firstly, I think there's a different normal for everybody. So again, it depends on the undergraduate. So from the lecturer's perspective, definitely I think our lecturers and our colleagues are much more confident in the online space. So that may lead to more development of online and blended learning. So obviously more opportunities, particularly for us as we're going into the ATU as well. So another aspect as well is some students, like as you mentioned, disadvantaged groups, maybe mature learners, prefer the online model. But our own undergraduates, your average 18 to 21-year-old, they want to come on site. They need to mix with their peers. So I think what is normal will be different for everybody. And again, I think what we're going to have is a lot of different types of models that maybe we hadn't considered before. So.
We have to really think about all the different personas. Yeah.
Yes, to think about the different, your learner.
Exactly, the learner.
What is your course? Is it a postgrad?
Yeah.
And maybe then blended or online will suit. If it's an undergrad, what we're finding is, they want, that's my own experience from teaching undergrad, they want to be back in, they want to be meeting their friends. If that's your cohort, say, which is your standard undergrad across the university. So I think there's a normal will be different for everybody.
Yes, absolutely. And Jessica, you have a couple of comments to share that are coming in on the chat.
One here answering the biggest impact of COVID seems to be a disconnect with institution and peers. This is impacted on both students and staff. The challenge is how to constitute or reconstitute genuine learning communities.
Very good. And that goes back to our theme yesterday, all about the community development piece. Tony, any more comments? Is there another?
Just in relation to the,
Kevin?
the 92% or whatever it was there, like during the pandemic, that was particular. Excuse me. sorry. That was particularly under pressure because I suppose it was unique in that a lot of people were working from home, so like the students' parents might be at home doing online meetings all the time, and students might also be trying to access it. So even if you have good access, it was still potentially an issue during that time. Obviously it's a bit different now, maybe, but you know, that was, even though we've got great coverage, it was still potentially an issue with students doing online learning.
They were all competing at home for,
Yeah,
so, and it is different. We've more people back in the workplace or working on site. How are those comments, Tony? Do you have further questions for us, or?
No, I've just got a couple of more slides to go through, and then I'm finished. So if we can put the slides back up, thank you. I probably have to refresh. There we go. There we go. Okay, so we're moving from I'm suggesting that the big shift is a move from information transmission, delivery of content, to knowledge management, helping students know where to find information, how to analyze it, decide its relevance, its reliability, and so on, and how to apply that to what they're learning. We need a mix of skills development and content, but we need to focus a lot more on how we teach skills and how we measure those skills and how we make sure students are progressing in those skills as they go through university or college education. I see increasingly lecture-based courses being replaced by student projects, problem-based learning, collaborative learning. This is a class size issue. The bigger the class, the harder it is to do this. I think we may need to go back and look at, certainly in some universities, particularly some of the bigger research universities, how we allocate students to instructors. I'm not sure we can go on giving these very large lecture-based classes that we have in North America, even after COVID. Who wants to go into a room with 200 people when everybody's got flu, for instance, or colds, heavy colds, and so on? I think we need to rethink the whole large lecture class and think of different ways of doing that. And I see increasingly goodbye written exams being replaced by students developing e-portfolios of work, demonstrating not only what they know, but also the skills that they can do. Here in British Columbia now, students in teaching practice have to record their lessons and reflect on those lessons and put that all together in a video, which they then submit to the external accreditors as part of their teaching practice. And I see that kind of method of assessment, not just recording stuff, but also reflecting on it by the students, so they can say, this is what I learned from this experience. I think that's going to be a much more powerful form of assessment than the standard written exams. So I think there is a paradigm shift happening. It's happening slowly, thank goodness. But I think eventually that all content that we want to use in teaching will be free, open, and available online. That will be through open education resources, open textbooks, open data, open research publications, plus the whole of the internet. Students can now find, evaluate, analyze, and apply content. This is a key 21st century skill. They're going to need to be able to do that after they leave university or college. And I see this as a huge shift in teaching and learning from the traditional instructor in charge, regular 3 hours a week of lecturing, etc. I see a huge shift coming in that. What would an advanced digital learning course look like? Well, it will be built around the core skill of knowledge management. It would have open content within a learning design. In other words, you would provide a framework for students to go and look for appropriate content. They would have tasks to do, which would require collection of that content and so on. Student-generated multimedia content, online project work, assessment by e-portfolios. That's just one possible design. I've seen some of those designs coming out here in Canada. We have the graphic there is from a graduate course, easy with graduate students to do this, where students come in and there is no fixed curriculum other than a range of skills that have to be developed during the course. This is actually on developing a business using learning around learning technology. And when the students come in, their first week is they have to do research on what kinds of new media are out there and how it might be used in education. There is some kind of teaching built around how to do a business plan and how to do a pitch, but the students basically decide on the content of this course. In other words, the instructors are saying what skills they want developed, but the students can use any content they want that will help them develop those skills. And that's just one example. So I have two views of the future. One is pessimistic, that we will go back mainly to in-person lectures. Fully online becomes mainly Zoom lectures, forcing out the previous and effective asynchronous online learning. I think that is a real possibility. But my optimistic view is that in the future, students will have choices. They can decide how they want to study, fully in person, blended, or fully online. And we'll be using effective learning design that will combine strengths of both in-person and online synchronous and asynchronous learning. So over to you. Further questions? I think we're running out of time, actually. But I hope you found this of use and of interest. Thank you.
I'm sure we've questions. Can you hang on a few more minutes?
Of course, yes. I have the whole day ahead.
We have one. Sorry, Sean, do you want to go first? Yeah?
Yeah, I was just wondering, my big fear, of course, is the idea of there's open information and students go out there and find it, and you give them tools to analyse and so on and so forth. It's just there's so much information out there that's going to be grabbed contextless digitally from where it came from. And I think there is a lot of, it sounds great that we could go out and get it, but there's a lot of work that needs to go into building a framework for students within which they can amalgamate that information and within which they can recognise context. Excuse me. And just I have a real worry about this sort of utopia of information freely available and grabbed from anywhere. It's going to lose meaning and context, and you know it can be dangerous. And we see that now with quotes and bits grabbed from here and there and cobbled together to support anything, or to it's a fear I have of all this information that can lead to a contextlessness or a grabbing of it, you know, a putting out of context. And I suppose my question would be, what can we do about that? What are the...
No, I agree. I agree that I did qualify what I said by saying it has to be within a learning design framework. In other words, you can't just send students out to look for any information. You have to give them guidelines and criteria. You have to maybe demonstrate yourself how you go out and find information and collect it. So yes, there has to be guidance and a framework for students. It has to be part of the design of the course, and then there may need to be some direct teaching at the beginning of the course to get students set up and ready to go. And it will vary on the age of the student, whether they're first year or graduate and so on. Obviously, the older and more mature the students, the more they can handle this kind of open access to to information and knowledge. but and the younger and the less experienced, the more direction they will need. But that's why I think you have to have a strategy as an instructor, and that's why you have to have curriculum discussions so that students progress as they move through from being fairly tightly guided to being more open and more flexibility in how they study the subject.
And when we think about the learning design workshops that we run with colleagues, Sean, they just become so crucially important that, you know, bedding down and looking at the whole experience and how content is managed that you're bringing into the programme, and how students are, I suppose, introduced to the wide open content that is available, and what's, I suppose, reputable sources and what's maybe not core course material or whatever. But is there any other questions here? Or is there questions? Sorry, a couple online. Sorry, Tony.
How might we persuade the professional bodies to evolve? For example, in law, they insist on traditional closed book written exams for 70-80% of all modules. I guess we can still teach these principles, but the assessment needs to evolve.
Sorry, I didn't hear that. Can you repeat it, Karina? Sorry, I didn't hear that. Can you
You'll have to
repeat
come
it?
closer.
Can you hear me now, Tony?
Yeah.
Okay, so the question was, how might we persuade the professional bodies to evolve? For example, in law, they insist on traditional closed book written exams for about 70 to 80% of all modules. I guess we can still teach these principles, but the assessment needs to evolve. So just in general about where there's restrictions there on, or potentially suggestions on how to assess, and large amounts of the modules are like that.
Yes, I'm afraid the professional bodies can be a real brake on innovation and change. We've had problems with the engineering professional association here. Basically, there has to be an ongoing discussion between the instant decision professional association. They try to protect their existing members, and this change could be a real challenge to existing membership of professional associations. And I don't see an easy solution to this. I think it just needs a lot of discussion and sitting down at the table and explaining why things need to change and how it will benefit employers. I think the skills agenda is the way to go on this, to say that we need to improve the teaching of skills to make sure that the workforce is better prepared. We need to get employers behind this, and then the professional associations are more likely to change. But it needs conversation. It needs a lot of work to get this changes methods accepted.
Thanks, Tony. And there's another question here, Kevin. Or is it more a comment?
Bit more comment that one.
Do you want to read out the comment?
Yeah, there's just a comment here from John Boyd. So John is just saying, what we understand as the internet and what undergraduates understand as the internet are entirely different things. Leverage the resources that are unique to our region. The best blend is a guided catalogue of approved resources and experiential learning in our region. So that was just from John there.
Okay, that's great. Any other comments there?
There's one from Perry Share actually just as well. The Victoria University Australia, I think it is, block teaching model is an interesting and reportedly effective approach. So I think there's a link there as well in the chat.
Yeah,
for that.
great. Thanks, Perry.
Yeah.
And I suppose I might have, is there another question? Oh, sorry, Anne, you have a question? What was it? Oh, yeah. I've one last question, Tony, for you. And I suppose I'm just looking for your view on work-based learning degrees. It's something, or, project-based learning degrees. And it's an area that we're, I suppose, putting a bit of focus on under a project that we're involved with, Higher Ed 4.0. It's just a project for our university. And we've many innovators in the institute or in the university looking at work-based learning degrees. Your experience around that and managing online and flexible learners that might be engaging with work-based learning degrees, any comments or lessons learned perhaps from Canada?
Very, this is a big question. Very briefly, I think there are two things when I talk about skills development, I'm thinking about empowering the individual with the skills that will allow them to work in the workforce. The danger of training for a specific employer or a specific job is that those jobs can just disappear overnight and be replaced by others. What you need are what the Royal Bank of Canada here calls transversal skills, skills that students can take from one job to another, like communication skills. So I think we have to be very careful that, yes, we need to talk to employers about what they want, and we need to talk to them about teaching methods and what we're trying to achieve in our teaching methods. But I make a distinction here between competency-based learning and regular learning. Competency-based learning is very useful for teaching specific job skills and so on. But we need to be very careful about that we're actually empowering the workforce rather than training for specific jobs. It's not quite the same. I'll stop at that point. I could say a lot about this, but
it's another day and another seminar, really. But no, just interested in your views, and we might take you back to talk to us again on that. So listen, I think that's the questions closed. Is that right, Jessica? So just on behalf of the university, ATU, thank you so much, Tony, for joining us this afternoon. It's just been very insightful and a real pleasure to get your insight. And I hope you get another 1 million hits from your book over the next couple of years on the next edition. When's the third edition due?
yeah, well, I'm more than halfway through, so it should be ready by the fall.
Okay, well, do let us know. Tag us on Twitter. Yeah, brilliant. Thanks so much again, Tony. Thank you.